Evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. This is our fourth year of the Tom Twomey series, and this is our initial evening. We like to have a mix of local and national topics. Clearly, this is a national topic, and everybody's interested in tonight. It's a record turnout, so we're very glad you came. We've learned a little bit from the past 3 years, and we keep on trying to adjust the program to fit the most number of people that can attend. So we've now gone to a Saturday sort of program in May, September, and October. And in June, July, and August, we will go to a Friday evening. And a special event this year is we're adding a garden talk and tour on July 7th. It's a Saturday morning, and it will start here. And then we're going to tour 4 very exquisite gardens that are petite in East Hampton. I'd like to thank our media sponsors, LTV, who relentlessly come here and film this program after program, and Hamptons.com. For the evening events, we will be serving Prosecco and some sort of little nibbly, and that's thanks to Judith Hope, the wife of Tom Twomey, who the series was named for. I'd like to thank the board members who worked very diligently this year, and some friends of the library who also worked diligently this year to put this program together. Because we had a large number of people working on this, I think we came up with a broader range of topics, and we were able to pull in a lot of neighbors who have famous neighbors of some of the board members, and you can see that in the schedule. I want to do a special thanks to Charlie Collins, Sarah Davidson, Patty Farron, Judith Hope, Carrie Lamparter, who's our PR person and is responsible for this evening's presentation. Yay. Sheila Rogers, our president. Sheila. And Brooke Kroeger, who will, journalism professor at NYU, who will introduce our program tonight and our speaker. And if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. We're so delighted to have you here and to see such an enthusiastic, I can already feel it, crowd. We're going to stipulate that everyone is following the news. And so what we'd like to do with Jim, if he'll allow us, is to get behind the scenes a little bit, to ask the things that we're not getting to read in the paper or see on television often with Jim, as we see him on MSNBC. I catch him early in the morning sometimes. Jim has just been part of the team that won the Public Service Pulitzer, what was it, 8 days ago, for the work on Me Too. He is also the mediator columnist, which is a little bit on hiatus because the news has been quite a crush, a writer at large for the magazine, a former national political correspondent for the paper who co-led the paper's 2012 presidential campaign coverage, so he has a foot in many camps. And before joining the Times back in 1996, he worked for the New York Daily News and then as a television reporter for the New York Observer. So welcome, Jim. Thank you so much for doing this, and another thank you to Carrie for making this possible.
That was pre-Kushner, my Observer time.
Oh, okay. Then we'll stipulate that as well. So back, I looked today or the other day at one of your early Mediator columns, not early, but a recent one, that was dated January 12th, 2017. It was right after President Trump's inaugural news conference, and he was president-elect at the time, just about to be inaugurated. And that was the conference at which he decried CNN as fake news, derided other news organizations with similar epithets. And in the column, you drew what you called 2 big lessons from that performance and the months of campaigning that had preceded them. One was, quote, that Trump remains a master media manipulator who used the occasion, that press conference, to, quote, expertly delegitimize the news media and make it the story rather than the chaotic swirl of ethical questions that engulfed his transition. And of course, I think it would be fair to say the next 16 months that we have experienced of the presidency itself. And 2, the the second big lesson was that the news media, quote, remains an unwitting accomplice in its own diminishment as it fails to get a handle on how to cover this new and wholly unprecedented president. So it is now 16 months later since you wrote those words. So I'd like to know if those two big lessons still hold, or would you amend them if you were writing that column today? And if they were lessons, take us through the learning process and all the tests that the Times aced, passed, and flunked along the way to get to that realization, or what you've come to understand since.
Now, I have no recollection of writing that column. Like, at all. So much has happened. Like, every week is like a lifetime with this president. I think...
the stages of grief. You know, like,
Yeah.
what's happened along the way?
For us. Well, I think in the first thing, the idea that he was a master manipulator, what was my second point in that master manipulator part? It was that he's a master manipulator, and you reread the first part.
Yeah, I can. Trump remains a master media manipulator who used the occasion, that news conference,
Yes.
to expertly delegitimize the news media and make it the story rather than the chaotic swirl of ethical questions surrounding him.
Okay, so that I would say I would amend. I think it was right for the time, but I don't think that he's got everyone now talking about the press, right? He can't He tries, but you know, there are how many investigations right now? There's Special Counsel Mueller. There's the Southern District of New York that's looking into his lawyer and other associates. So I think that we've seen. I don't like that strategy. I've told his people this directly as media columnist at the Times. It's, you know, I think it's bad for society. It's bad for democracy to constantly attack real journalism as fake. That said, we see that it's mostly taken hold with people who support him, but not most Americans, right? And not everyone who supports him even. I think like his real core. So that has definitely changed.
Do you still consider him a master manipulator of media?
I don't. I mean, he obviously is very good at filling the air, right? The airtime and the air. Even now, when the news is bad for him, it's all him, right? So he can still redirect with the tweet or redirect with some crazy move. But the crazy move is a governmental move, right? And when I wrote that, was that even before he was inaugurated? So in a campaign setting or even a transition setting, he's not running the government. So now a crazy move actually has huge implications that I think people appreciate because it could affect their lives.
And what about the role of the press as an unwitting accomplice in its own diminishment?
And I think that sometimes is the case. I think when you go, not you, because we don't do it at the Times, but cable news will do it, give him 45 minutes to say a story is fake and say things that aren't true, or CNN or MSNBC, and certainly Fox very much at night especially, lets people come on and say things that aren't true and they don't get checked. I think that's bad, but I'll take primetime of Fox off the table because it's really more about mainstream news saying, let's let them bash us all day long. Sometimes I do think that showing the press conference, the daily press briefing at the White House, maybe that shouldn't be shown live. Maybe you take parts of it. You can still show it, you know. I mean, it is, the press briefing is any White House's way of talking to the American people. It's not what we do. For our jobs, it's for newspaper reporters, or whatever we're called now, it's not vital. But I don't see why cable news can't. If something is said that's important, show that. Don't let Sarah Huckabee Sanders say something that's patently false, unchecked, and then they're rarely going to get back to it and say, when she said that, it was false. Yeah.
What about the role in the diminishment? Have ways been found to check that at the door?
I mean, that's hard, right? Because I think when we engage in a fight of we're not fake, right? It's a when did you stop beating your wife conundrum, right? Like, you don't want to be constantly justifying what you do. You just have to do your job. And by the same token, I think sometimes when I see, and again, I see this more on TV, but I see it on Twitter, when there's an emotion that's brought to it because people are angry when they're being called fake. I think that diminishes the press. Everyone has to do their job, tell the truth, don't get pulled into a fight with the president if you can avoid it. It's just not what we're there for. We're there to,
but would you still say that this is a new and wholly unprecedented president?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that it required,
Without question.
And then it required a new way of dealing with things. So where were the junctures along these last 2+ years where those moments came where a new strategy was needed and a new strategy was deployed?
I think you could see it in, for instance, the Washington Post is keeping this running tally of falsehoods.
Okay.
We've never done that, right? It's hit
Right.
3,000. Dan Balls, I'm using the Washington Post not to avoid talking about the Times, but it's just they've had a couple of recent examples. Dan Balls, who I've known who is the most sober-minded political reporter, he's like the dean of the political press corps, used the word lie recently in one of his columns. So using lie to...
You've used the word lie, not you personally, but the Times
has. And I personally don't love using that word.
Why?
Because it's about intent. So when you know it's intent, use it, but false covers it, right? Like, I think as long as something's false, it's false. Some people really want to see lie. I think it's got to be intent. So,
Okay.
but that's a change, right?
Others?
I think in the middle of stories, there's a lot more in print stories, stopping, telling the reader this is false, right? Once I did a column, there was so much, we're on TV, right, BS, that I started using footnotes because I didn't want to break up the column. You're trying to like make an argument. You don't want to have to stop every 2 seconds and true squat it. But so we're just trying as we go. But the basics are still the same. Report really hard, tell the truth, and I think, and we make our mistakes. Unfortunately, it's a human endeavor. But I think journalism's been doing some amazing work the last year.
You too. Any other strategic moves that have been made at certain junctures where the wholly unprecedented slams you in the face?
It's kind of like a case-by-case basis, right? So,
An example.
let me think. I mean, in my current story, they're small things that don't seem like a big deal, right? How many people did we talk to so people know that we're telling the truth, right? 10 White House officials, interviews with 37 people who...
So that's new. That would be different
Yeah,
than
they're
usual.
listing the numbers of sources. These are small things. Another thing that we've done, which is very different, is when I started at the Times in the year 2000, it was very much, you are just part of the hive. You don't stand out. It's not about you. It's about the paper, which is, I still believe that myself. That said, the paper's decided that it's best to show what we're about, who we are, what do we think. And in fact, we let this documentary crew from, now it was bought by Showtime, run around with us for a year. And it was very uncomfortable, and but it showed what goes, it's coming out, I think in a couple of weeks, and but it showed what goes into the reporting.
There's an article about it just yesterday.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's new.
Okay, so more transparency, more into the process, see how the sausage is made.
Yes.
One follow-up has to be the irony of what this has meant for the bottom line at the Times, the interest that we see in all things presidential in a way that probably is not always so true. I don't think I've ever been able to recite so many cabinet members' names, especially with the way they revolve, but it's really a different kind of time. That must feel a little odd, how much is being gained from something that's created so much extra work and difficulty, but also probably a constellation of feelings.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, when I started as a media columnist in, it was early 2016, it was like they opened a vault to me. The publisher and the chief executive said, come up, now we have to tell you what's going on. And they sat me down and they were like, it is grim. Like, we are in huge trouble, right? And they're going to be, you just have to understand this, how bad it is. In fact, the CEO of the paper said to me, I'm like a surgeon up to my elbows in blood. I don't know how we're going to save this thing. And then Trump shows up. And it's like unbelievable how much things changed. So subscriptions are, we had a goal where we had to reach, we still have the same goal, and we're still not out of the woods at all. I mean, it's a constant fight. But we need something like to have 10 million subscribers in the next few years. But now we're on a clip to actually do it. So now we're at 3.7 million. So
Great.
I think it's 3.7 million. So it's clicking along. And it's Trump. Now the fear is but I do think it's also the pace of news, to be honest. As long as there's a constant flow of sensational news, it just happens to be, and sensational, I mean sensational, not as in great, just sensational.
Got it.
Big stories, big stuff. Trump provides that. So if he were to disappear tomorrow, would the clicks still come? I think they still might, and the subscriptions, I think
Why
they
do you
still
think
might.
so?
Because it's about the pace of news. Does news still stay fast? And our stories, I think the way we cover stories, they feel bigger. I don't know. There's just something beyond him. But he's the biggest beneficiary of it, the biggest causer of it. And, I think it also hurts him and it hurts us. So it's a big mess.
Okay.
That's my quote. It's a big mess. If you take away nothing else, it's a big mess. Yeah.
So if we look at, the Times had 3 Pulitzers, 11, 12 days ago.
Yes.
Two of which were, one of which was for the Me Too reporting that Jim was part of, and that was a public service award. And then there was a national reporting award as well for bringing more clarity to the nation's understanding of Russian interference in our 2016 elections. Jim had reported extensively on Russia back in September, talking about the Kremlin's new 21st century information weaponry, a piece you really should read that was in the magazine and you can pull up online. Then Jim had to sort of put his column on hiatus and moved into the Me Too coverage, covering Harvey Weinstein and all that has followed, including the demise of so many major media figures, and I want to hit on that again in a minute. Then there were the We Twos, meaning Stormy Daniel and Karen McDougal, that Jim has covered dutifully day in and day out, and the 2 Michaels, Avenatti and Cohen. This has all been part of Jim's brief. Now, this great work that you have been doing and sharing with colleagues, and we think we understand why there are often multiple bylines, because all this reporting on sexual assault and harassment and influence peddling that might be something more or might not, we're waiting to hear about that, and the Russian interference, turn out to all be surprisingly intertwined. So in a way that can't possibly have been expected. So take us through that.
No problem.
Tell us what you can about what we don't know.
All right, first of all, Matt Lauer is not here, right?
Oh.
Right. He's nearby. I know he's been spotted a lot around lately. Well, I'll start that I was just minding my business, doing my column. That's my job, it's a column. And I think after we were in a real journalistic dogfight, and this is where journalistic competition's so good, with Ronan Farrow of The New Yorker. I don't know if you all have heard of him.
He also shared this Pulitzer.
Yeah, he shared the Pulitzer and sold his second book. You can catch him on the speaking circuit. No, he's great. He's a fierce competitor. And so he was covering the Harvey Weinstein story as well. So they asked me to help because they were trying to do the complicity machine. How did he get away with this? I was doing columns on Harvey the whole time because that's my beat, the media beat. And I'd been there when we were covering Fox and O'Reilly. Nothing happens without the O'Reilly story, I think. That's the critical piece of this is what the reporters on that, Emily Steele, Michael Schmidt.
When did the gender group come together at the Times?
Well, after O'Reilly.
Okay.
But the key thing that they figured out in the reporting of the O'Reilly story was that you shoot and you miss if you don't really have it nailed. And it's hard to nail these. It had traditionally been hard to nail these stories. People didn't want to go on the record. It would devolve into this fruitless he said, she said. But what they figured out is if you could get settlements, legal settlements, as a reporting tool, you could really show, then the argument's over, right? And you could start really having a strong basis for a story. So anyway, they wanted my help on the Harvey complicity machine. It so happened that one of the characters who had tried to help Harvey in the complicity task was my old boss, AJ Benza, the gossip columnist at the Daily News, who I used to work for. And AJ was very open with me that Harvey had paid him. He was retired from gossip, and Harvey had hired him to sort of help dig dirt and find out what was going on. So Harvey also used the National Enquirer to look into people who were making accusations, and the Enquirer used its reporting muscle to call people who he thought might accuse him of doing something wrong to help him. Now, they said there was a business relationship there. They were protecting that, whatever. So out of that, we start realizing, hey, the National Enquirer had also done some of this for President Trump. So out of that story, I said to the bosses, this pattern that we've unearthed here regarding Harvey applies to Trump. The Wall Street Journal broke the first story about Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels 4 days before the campaign, and before Election Day, and nobody really. I noticed it at the time, but no one had noticed it.
Was there not an earlier Stormy story also, like in 2011?
No, she had interviewed for a story that didn't get published.
Run. Okay.
Yeah. But so we knew, because it was a great media story, the National Enquirer bought off someone who was going to make this allegation against the president, Karen McDougal. So we realized that story had not been touched. After they broke it, they didn't go back to it. It just sort of was a dead story. And so we realized, I said, you guys have to get some reporters on that now that this Harvey thing's done. You guys go do that. And they said, great idea. You got the assignment. So, so that was how that started. But we were on to Stormy Daniels and Karen, and new stuff on Karen McDougal from November. So, and the Journal got back on it at around the same time. They've done an amazing job, so it's almost unfortunately for us. But again, that idea of competition, the Journal and it driving, we're just trying to beat each other. You have to be accurate, you have to be right. You don't want to be so fast that you make a mistake. But there's been a great competition on this story. But I always thought, or very early on, I started thinking somehow this stuff is going to lead back to Russia. I just thought it. I really did. I just could tell by the way it was going, the questions about this LLC that got set up. We were hearing about an LLC that got set up too before that broke, and the Journal beat us on that. And then we were all off to the races. But things weren't adding up, and it just all seemed very questionable. And I could see it linking up with Russia even more as we go. But who knows?
Then came the Michaels.
Then came Michael Avenatti. So Michael Avenatti comes onto the scene. We were ourselves trying to talk to Stormy, actually Stephanie Clifford. Actually, one of my colleagues was at her manager, Gina Rodriguez's house when Michael Avenatti gets on the scene. She says, now you have to deal with this guy. Sort of, who's this guy? And it's like out of a movie, right? He comes with this briefcase, and it's like a Glenn Ross meets like, I don't know, Mr. Wolf from the what was the movie? The Fixer, right? The Harvey Keitel Fixer. What's the movie? Anyway, you get the idea. So he's just this guy out of a, and so he takes over the story, and now we in the press have to kind of deal with him. But he's very savvy.
Talk about him a little bit.
He has his own agenda, right? He's basically, I think we feel like he's taking our story away, when he comes on the scene. And he just takes it and he starts doling it out. And I remember he was telling us, well, I got something for you, but then I'm going to have something for CNN. I'm going to have something for MSNBC. Got a lot of hungry mouths to feed, which is not how we like to get our own information. So I don't think he quite understands that part.
Today he was threatening anybody and everybody who's had any dealings with Michael Cohen. He said, I'm coming for you. It'll be out there. You might as well
Well,
tell.
The question is, what does he have up his sleeve? Maybe he has something, maybe he doesn't.
It seems to be off his brief a little, doesn't it?
I don't know what his ultimate strategy is, but he is very effective. I mean, there's just no question. He's the most effective I've seen in sort of dealing with the sort of Trump presidency in a sort of combative way. I mean, the Democrats aren't doing what he's doing. There have been some questions about who's paying him. He says that he isn't being paid by Democratic donors, but people are looking into that. He says it's not. There's a crowdfunding site for Stormy Daniels, who also has been a genius in trying to exploit this. I don't think that Michael Avenatti loves it the way she does it all the time, but And then there was the Karen McDougal case, and that was very different because Karen McDougal's lawyer is much more mild-mannered. She really didn't want to do what Stormy Daniels is doing, and her case is very important because what her case showed was that, this might get a little complicated, so I'll try to do it as simply as possible, was that the president's lawyer, Michael Cohen, was in touch with her lawyer at the time, Keith Davidson, who also represented Stormy Daniels at the same time.
Right.
While Karen McDougal was dealing with AMI, Michael Cohen should not have been talking to her lawyer during that deal, and that touched off the Southern District of New York. The prosecutors in New York are very interested in that, and so was her lawsuit was really built around that to get out of her deal with AMI. So there's just a lot, and there's still a lot we just don't know. And
then Russia, back in the picture.
How about that?
How did that play for you?
Well, again, it's interesting because when Michael Avenatti drove up this week with his latest information, we had already broken a story that Mueller's team went to an airport to interview a Russian oligarch, Viktor Vekselberg. And so he winds up paying Michael Cohen. Now, like all the Russia stuff, their public answer is, no, there's an innocent explanation for this. He just wanted it's not him, it was his American subsidiary.
Cousin.
Yeah, his cousin, who's American. So it's just a kind of coincidence, and we know how it looks. Viktor Vekselberg, by the way, is on the sanction list, the latest one. Yeah. But Avenatti promoted that on TV as if Vekselberg paid Cohen to cover the Stormy Daniels payment. We do not have reporting to show that, but I'd like to know a lot more about what was going on there.
There you go.
Yeah.
So I was listening last night to a podcast you did from March on the Daily. Does anyone else listen to the Dailies? They're so good. And you were waxing a little philosophical about Stormy and Karen. I know that.
And it works out really well with Stormy Daniels' story.
Exactly, it's perfect. And you were talking about the question of being silenced. That's what it was about, like the silencing of a person with less power over against someone with wealth and power who doesn't want something disclosed that this person knows. And you raise the question, both of the very practice of non-disclosure agreements, and also of catch and kill, which is of course what happened in the McDougal case, where the Inquirer bought the story, telling her they were going to publish it, and of course their only intention was to help a pal and bury that story very, very deep in the ground and never to be heard from again. And you were questioning those practices in a way that made me think that was a larger discussion with your colleagues or in circles where you really thought about this in a way that, that's what Pete Hamill would call I didn't know that, I never thought of it that way, where you're asking the question of even these practices and where they come from. Am I right?
Like the NDAs in general.
Yeah.
And
the catching, just these practices that have to do with somebody powerful making an agreement with someone who's not really in a position to be an equal.
Yeah, because so if you look at the two stories, Weinstein and Trump, they're very different, right? And it was a different reporting challenge because you could go to someone who had been abused by Harvey, or allegedly or truly abused. These cases will go through the court system, I think. But you could see that someone who's in the Harvey case or even the O'Reilly case, and your story needs to be told, it'll help other women, you were abused. I'm not saying it's always hard, but there's a straighter case to try to convince somebody to talk to you. It's much harder to convince someone to talk to you who had a consensual affair.
That's right.
Right, who cut a deal to get paid, right, and felt like, okay, I got what I wanted out of that legal agreement.
Services rendered, my service is I'll shut up.
Which they thought at the time they were doing. But now when you get onto the idea that the lawyer who represented both women, there are questions about whether he was an honest broker, right? He has long relationships with the AMI. He became ever closer and closer with Michael Cohen. So were they a reporting question? It's just a reporting question. I'm not making an allegation here, but was there more going on between them? We'd like to know that. So then you start realizing, okay, yes, you say whatever you want to say about Stormy Daniels and what she wanted to get out of this deal, but she's up against formidable forces. It's not equal, right? It's not. So that kind of that's how our thinking evolved. Because in the beginning, it was like, how do we go to her and say, you must talk to us? You know, it was much harder. And especially because one of my partners on the Trump stuff was one of the leads on the Weinstein stuff, Megan Twomey, and she found that hard to adjust. You know, it was an adjustment, right? It's a different argument you're making to the person you want to draw out.
Kind of a new argument, really. But that's how it struck me. It was a different way of thinking and talking about those kinds of issues.
And I hope the idea of the NDA, like really, we keep challenging what that is and what its purpose is. As a journalist, we just hate them anyway.
Sure.
Right? But what are they being used for?
So I've asked this sort of, but I want to ask it a different way. There's a lot of prurient coverage that isn't so Timesian all the time, though there have been other occasions, I guess Spitzer and others where that's happened.
I've never written a campaign finance story that got this many clicks. We had porn stars in all these campaign finance stories. We could reform the system yesterday.
So we have to know, what is that like in the Times newsroom? What is that like in your team?
I mean, first of all, it's hard, right? Or it's not hard, it's fun, but at times. But it's about serious things, right? I've said all along, no matter whether it leads to Russia or not, there's a campaign finance question here. The campaign finance law is that you can only give a candidate $5,000 roughly an election cycle.
Right.
This is a $130,000 payment that Michael Cohen says he paid himself. Now we know he got reimbursed, but they're huge campaign finance questions about that payment alone. So that's the serious part. But I remember the first meeting we had about the players in this is back in November, and it's Stormy Daniels. Stormy, who? You're sure it's not Summer Zervos? Because she's the one who's brought another case against Trump, and a harassment case. No, not Summer, Stormy. So there's been there's that classic gallows humor around it.
So if there was the 2011 story that did not get published, that means something was done to quash that story, correct?
Well, what's been reported so far, but again, I think we only know 30% of everything on each part of this. There was the story that's out there right now is that Michael Cohen made threats against Bauer Publishing, which owned In Touch magazine, to not run the story.
Okay, so that would be the argument that was to save the marriage, that would be not to embarrass the wife.
Well,
that would not make sense again in 2016 if it had already happened 5 years earlier.
Potentially, but one thing to remember, and we've been thinking about this, because by the way, what Rudy Giuliani's been trying to do on TV.
Do tell!
If you must know, if you need a Rudy translator here.
A Rudy Rooter?
Yeah. What he's trying to do is say, well, if there was a pattern of paying off women not connected to the campaign, then if he did this, and I'm not saying he did, it was coincidental that it was during the campaign, or that was an add-on, but there's a pattern here.
This is the same case twice, so that doesn't
Well,
make
but also in
sense.
2011, we tend to forget even, is that Donald Trump was very seriously considering a run for the presidency.
Oh.
So
same problems.
So 2011 still isn't that different. Was there a payoff in 07 or 06, and how many?
Those.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Giuliani also said, Mayor Giuliani said that for some reason, Michael Cohen was reimbursed to the tune of $460,000, later amended to $420,000 by a different official close to the president. So what was all that money for? And he basically said, could be for another Stormy Daniels-like case,
Who's
That's such an
quiet.
incidental expenses. So I think Stormy Daniels was an incidental expense.
Well, I mean, for me personally, it's been exciting to see the Time take on these gender issues with a new seriousness and to have such results in the larger journalistic community and affirmation. I really like that. The journalistic community itself has been called to account on this score, as we've mentioned before, and the Times itself has had its own stories even as recently as this week.
Yep.
I can't help that this has caused another kind of internal soul searching at the Times, beyond the obvious complaint, verification, and dismissal or reassignment, which have been the two cases that you have had. But more than that, is there anything structural going on? Is there, a new look at best practices? Is there a way of making an HR department see things differently? I mean, I don't know what, but it seems to me this is one of the few cases where, as journalists, the role is to inform, to explain, to expose, not to take action. It's to get others to take action. That's the role. This is a case where there's action that can be taken because you're in it. So
Right.
what's going on?
Well, one caveat I'll offer is I'm not management, so
I know.
so I can't. So I'll tell you what I think is going on, but like.
But even in the newsroom, even as well.
I mean, there's a huge shift. And one thing I want to say, by the way, to answer something you asked earlier before I get to that, is you had asked how the gender team came together, and it was out of the O'Reilly case. Our boss, Dean Becke, and other editors said, "Who else are we? There's got to be more of this. Who else are you hearing about out there?" And that's when Harvey's name comes up, and that's how the gender team kind of starts.
Great.
But internally, look, we just lost our Metro editor based on some allegations that. A lot of us in the newsroom don't even know the full extent of them. I guarantee you, whatever they are, if they had come up a couple years ago, they would not have probably led to his dismissal. I mean, I don't know what they are, so that's, again,
Okay,
another
that's
big
fine.
caveat. I feel like there's been more talk. I don't know. I think there's some changes in the HR sort of structure. Newsrooms are not the best managed places. Let's
Right.
face it, it's people like me get promoted into some management thing. We can hardly do math, you know what I mean?
Me too.
That doesn't go for the business desk, but the rest of us. So it's not like people who grew up wanting to be managers. So I think that the way people talk to each other is changing in the newsroom a lot. I still hope it's a place
Is there
where
terror?
No, there's the opposite of terror. I think it's getting a little nicer, and that scares me because I do believe a newsroom should be a place where people yell at each other. You're under a lot of pressure, and no one should be sort of tiptoeing around when about the important things. But there's the way you treat each other, and that is a huge change. And I'd say the next generation, the youngest generation in the newsroom, has totally different expectations on how they should be treated. And sometimes people say, "Oh, they're entitled," but that actually, like, we're realizing maybe the way, just because we grew up this way doesn't mean it was right, and that's what Dean Becke says a lot. So there are some big changes, huge.
And how's the new publisher doing?
He's awesome.
Of course he is.
No. He's a genius. Yeah, smart, total genius. That's all I can say.
We'll leave
Yeah.
that at that. So I'm going to open this up to.
Yeah.
I'm going to open this up.
But he is a genius.
He really is.
Yeah.
I'm going to open this up to questions now, but I have a big request. First of all, I will repeat what you said for the camera. I'm going to ask you to keep it to a very crisp one sentence that ends with a question mark. If you don't, I'm going to cut you off. That's the plan. So we've got about 18 minutes, and I see a gentleman in the back. Speak up. I'll repeat it.
Reporter saying a question, they say, and I'm sorry, you did it once too.
I did it a whole lot.
They say, "Can you talk about?" Well, "Can you talk about?" is not a question. It's like,
No.
you tell us what you want. It's a different
So
thing.
the
can you
gentleman
just
has asked
that-
about a trend he has observed, that instead of reporters asking a direct question, they ask someone to expound on a subject, to talk about it. Is that good?
Well, I
Or
will
Jim.
say on that topic that you're talking about the kind of televised interviews that you see, right?
No, all kinds of interviews.
I mean, I think that I've been watching cable news lately with my just a jar, just gaping, like
too.
what.
What are they
So
doing?
I do think there's a little bit of that lazy question. They're not driving for answers, right? They're not interviewing for information. They're giving people a stage. I have to say, you watched me interview someone, it would be the lamest thing to watch in the world, because I'll say anything I need to say to get the information. So it could be like, yeah, that thing, as long as you can just draw them out. So the interviewing we see is performative, and I personally be very lousy at it. I wish it was driving for answers. That's the journalistic mission, and that's not what's happening a lot of the time on cable. It's about just like putting on a show, and That's not the journalism I didn't get into this. I got into this business to find stuff out, hopefully before everybody else.
This lady with the stripes.
I feel you do a very good job on exposing Russia, criminal activity, the money trail, the immoral, and yet I get a feeling that this news comes to us, but it never goes to the doorstep of the White House. It's like Teflon, and nobody is, my question is, why?
She's asking, why is it that all the great reporting we are seeing on all these various fronts does not seem to be penetrating the White House?
Well, because the president is very defensive about this for obvious reasons, but he really sees it as an attack on his legitimacy. So he doesn't want to hear it. And that building is based around him, right? Every president has that prerogative, but I think him even more, right? That's what's happening there. Again, what's going to matter is what the special counsel, what Robert Mueller comes up with. So, but no one should have any. I would never predict what that's going to look like. If there's a real charge that draws the president in, that will be one thing. What if there's not? But what if there are still serious charges in his orbit? That would have taken out any traditional, or really hurt any traditional president politically. That doesn't really happen with him. He's in a different movement. That's when we get back to the unprecedented part of this. His base, some of them actually like Putin, and they want better relations with Russia. So it is a different, he has a base that doesn't see Russia the same way as traditional Republicans used to, at least as I grew up in my business.
This gentleman with red tie.
What are the best arguments that all news is fake news?
But what about the argument that all news is fake news?
What's the best counter to that?
No, what's the best argument for that?
For there being fake news? It's not true. So I can't make that argument. I can't help you with that. So.
Gentleman with the red tie.
I can't help you
One
with
at a
that.
time. Gentleman with the red tie.
I'll answer it a different way, but you go.
Yes, sir.
Recently, Politico had a lengthy piece examining Trump's career, which has had a number of successes from his earlier years, whether it's building, writing, you name it. They reached the conclusion that following that first success, Trump's need to be in charge of events increasingly led him to make decisions which led to second acts which were inferior.
Question?
Which leads now to a suggestion that his second year is revealing that same traditional inclination to have a bad second act.
So what's the question, sir?
Would you agree with that?
My question is, have you a comment on the political analysis?
Okay, comment on this political analysis.
I think I don't agree with it per se. The question was that Politico wrote an article that said if you look at Trump's history, correct me if I'm wrong, but I read this because I read so many things every day. I think it was that he would follow up a great success with a great failure. Like he would always have a sophomore slump, kind of, right? That
Yes.
sort of and I just don't know if that's true because we'll see what happens in North Korea, but that is a great success. So, this year, if that were to come about as he's predicting it will, that would be a great success, and that would be better than he did at all in his first year. So, I just don't know. I don't know. Before we go on, can I ask you go back to the question before? So when you said, can you make an argument that all news is fake? What did you mean? Did you want me?
Okay. You mentioned footnotes.
Yes.
And, there are no footnotes in the paper version of the New York Times.
Right.
But there are hypertext links in the electronic version.
Correct.
Yes.
A subsidiary question would be how long is the paper version of the New York Times going to last? But one solution to the problem of, I'm a physicist, one solution, we have footnotes all over the place, and that's how we protect the facts. So hypertext is one answer, I think, but maybe you have others.
Well, that's why I did the footnotes actually really for the print reader, because I was worried about doing hyperlinks to stories to show something was false because the print reader can't do that. So I wanted to show in the paper, that's exactly what I was trying to do.
Trust but verify.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Sir?
How do you get people, and answer the question, how do you get people who believe in this fake news, that Trump is pushing this idea of fake news? How do you get those people who are obviously believing Fox News and believing a segment of the media where there is very biased? How do you get them to believe in your newspaper and the Post and all of these other newspapers that are actually serious, unbiased reporting?
How do you get those who have, we gotcha. How do you get those who believe in the delegitimization that we were talking about that is being promoted from the White House to understand that this is a falsity?
So I don't think we have a good answer to that yet. We just don't. And we're probably not putting enough of an effort into figuring that out because of just the demands of reporting the news.
Yeah.
But I do think there's something to the idea I mentioned up top about being more transparent about our process. Fake source. They make up their sources. We do not make up. I mean, that's preposterous. He knows it. He's sometimes been two different sources when he's using his pseudonym or when he's using himself. So that's just preposterous, but that's why you'll see, and I don't know how many people will watch this Showtime show, and I don't know how many people will be interested, but that's the kind of thing that shows we're on the phone with sources. We are so worried about getting it wrong.
And there's 4 parts to it?
There are four parts to it, yeah.
The lady in the middle with the glasses on her head.
Thank you. I'm curious about the demographics or the characteristics of the new subscribers to the Times. So I'm really delighted to see this growth. And I'd love to know how those new subscribers differ, if they do, from your traditional audience.
What do we know about the many new subscribers to the New York Times?
And I'm not on top of the latest figures, so this is going to be very vague, but it's true. What AG, our brilliant new publisher, has told us is that it's younger than you would expect, that there are a lot of young readers buying the Times online.
That's great.
So I don't know that that's a majority, but there's a good, healthy, yeah.
Lady in red hair.
I appreciate that in any administration, there are a lot of unidentified sources at a White House.
Yes.
It seems to me, am I correct, that there are a lot of unidentified sources now who are talking against the White House? Is that different and unusual?
Well, I think the question...
Repeat the question.
The question was, are there more... There are so many unidentified sources, and every White House has them, but in this case, sometimes the unidentified sources seem to be undercutting the White House. Is that unusual? And without revealing anything, and also I can't really speak to it with knowledge either in terms of like what Maggie Haberman is doing every day, because she's, and Peter Baker and our White House team, they're amazing. But I think what happens is, without a traditional sort of chief of staff, White House used to work, when I covered the Bush White House, the chief of staff runs everything. He's empowered. And there's a process for everything, and decisions are made in a very orderly fashion. This White House doesn't have that. And his staff knows he reads the New York Times for everything he says about it, knows he watches Fox, knows he watches some CNN, some MSNBC, and they know what shows he watches. So I think what happens sometimes is people are maneuvering within the White House through us, right? And that's where it's tricky for us. Like, we don't want to be, there's always a process in reporting where you're using and being used, so we have to be careful about this, but I think it's people running their own agendas or trying to take out their rivals, right? So Bannon versus Priebus, there was all this, you can kind of sometimes see, I think I see fingerprints. I wouldn't say that if I knew, and I don't know, but.
Lady in black at the back.
Absolutely. Or the question was, is there a responsibility to keep going on Me Too reporting, and do we take responsibility for like the next stages of that in terms of covering it, right? And what we do ourselves too, right?
Where it gets less salacious, you know.
I think there's a huge responsibility because what we saw over the last years, it was a Pandora's box, right? There's so many repercussions that are still playing out. And I would say, you know, we'd have to do a lot more. And we have great resources at the Times. We're really lucky. We have, you know, more than most. And even that said, we're so busy covering so many things, the Trump administration, the Russia investigation, the EPA, but we cannot neglect that. And I appreciate the question because it's tricky, it's nuanced, and we have to stay on it, absolutely.
Gentleman in plaid.
Frank Rich wrote a column in New York Magazine. I don't know if you've read it. I assume you did.
I've skimmed it, but I need to sit down and really read it. But the Roy Cohn piece, yeah.
It painted both the media and all of us very badly. I'm wondering what your view on that is.
So the question is that Frank Rich wrote a New York Magazine piece about Roy Cohn, and the general idea was Roy Cohn was this ill-behaving character in New York, but the establishment kind of accepted him, went along with the jokes sometimes, had him at the dinner parties, right, and played along a little too much, and that sort of represents what happened in the
and the media.
And the media went along. And my very first column, when I took over the media column at the Times, was making the same point, that I thought there was a symbiosis between Trump and the media that gave him an advantage over all of his rivals. And I'm talking about a primary night where Hillary Clinton's victory speech and Bernie Sanders' victory speech doesn't get covered. They don't get covered, but the cameras stay with Trump for literally a Trump's steak press conference, like infomercial. Right? He brings out his products and starts selling them.
Oh, I remember
That was everything you needed to know about what was wrong. Yeah.
Oh, to the back. Yes, please.
Given the sustained attacks on Trump now for a year and a half, how do you account for his recent rise in polls?
Good question.
That's a good question. Well, first of all, the poll that gets cited the most, Rasmussen, is since long before Trump. My newspaper's always had. It's not a poll that we were allowed to report on because of it doesn't say how it does its polling. It doesn't meet our standards. Now things keep changing, and it goes into the mix of our data with other polls. But anyway, he has seen some bump. He's still not where any president wants to be at this stage of a presidency, but the economy's clicking along, right? Jobs are still being created, which we all know that's sort of a baseline. And he did just have success, the beginning of success in North Korea. So at the same time, every day there's what's the latest, that they won't apologize for staffers' crack about John McCain that was really unconscionable.
They don't want to.
So I think his poll numbers would be a lot higher if he didn't have that part.
Yes, sir.
Can you say your name, sir?
Is that a friend?
Yeah.
You were talking about the fact that in earlier White Houses there was a very distinct chain of command and a process where information was processed and then released. The Trump White House, as you said, is very chaotic. Do you think that he's now surrounding himself with people who are better adapted to working within that chaos? Or do you still think it's just a mess?
It's a mess.
You have to repeat the question.
The question was, is Trump now, as he's going along here, finding people who can adapt to his chaotic leadership style? And I think the answer is no. I mean, John Kelly, his current chief of staff, we hear reports, very credible reports about how frustrated he is, and he was the one who was going to bring order to this. I think Jared Kushner and Ivanka know how to surf his moods. She grew up doing that. But this is not. I can't imagine any true professional who's that comfortable with scrapping the Iran deal without a traditional National Security Council review of that, which we learned today did not happen. So, and there, and also the federal government and even the executive branch has a lot of career professionals, and we all know that they're tearing their hair out. So, and they would happily work for any president. They're not partisan. They just give us a real structure and let us bring our expertise to bear.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. What about people like Bolton, whose agenda seems to be coming true? And
His agenda's coming true now. So John Bolton. And Pompeo. So he asked about people like John Bolton, the new very hawkish national security advisor. He's only been there for 3 weeks. So, let's talk which we will. Let's talk in a month and see if he's still there.
Okay, last question. Who's got a great one? Don't be hesitant. Let's hear it.
Many articles state Trump states, and I read them. But how do you determine how large this base is in the country?
Oh.
And, what is it? Where do you get the information you're making your determination?
I think
How
that's a
large
good
is the
question.
president's base?
And we keep referring to it, and do we really know what we're talking about? And that's a great question, and I have to say that I haven't seen the latest poll on that, and so we're basing it on what we learned out of the campaign, the current broad polling number, but I haven't gone myself and looked really deep down into it. So it's a good question. We should keep pressing on that. Yeah, you're right. It's true. We should be careful with it. I'll bring that back to the office.
Thank you, everybody.